Xbox 360 Red Ring of Death. Your Xbox 360 didn't break like normal electronics. It announced its death. 3 red lights. No warning, no explanation, just a glowing circle that basically meant your console had given up on life mid-game. At its peak, the Xbox 360 had an estimated failure rate between 24% and 54%, and Microsoft shipped over 80 million units worldwide. One day, everything works. The next day, your console turns into a very expensive nightlight. The cause came down to heat and design trade-offs. The Xbox 360 used lead-free solder to meet environmental regulations, but that solder didn't handle repeated heating and cooling very well. Over time, the constant expansion and contraction would cause cracks, and eventually the GPU could detach from the motherboard. So technically, your console wasn't buggy, it was slowly pulling itself apart during every gaming session. The issue got so widespread that in July of 2007, Microsoft announced a $1.15 billion extended warranty program, the largest hardware repair program in gaming history. They extended coverage for red ring failures to 3 years globally, which is corporate speak for, yes, we see the problem. No, we're not pretending this is normal anymore. Then came the community phase of desperation. The most famous fix was the towel trick. You would wrap your Xbox in towels, turn it on, and deliberately overheat it to temporarily reflow the solder inside. And somehow, it worked. Not permanently, not safely, but just long enough to convince people they had hacked physics. Despite all of this, the Xbox 360 still dominated its generation. Xbox Live was ahead of its time, and it launched earlier and cheaper than the PS3. People kept buying it, even with the quiet understanding that one day, it might just stop. A $1 billion failure normally kills a product, but in this case, it became part of the identity. Because while Microsoft was dealing with consoles that refused to survive, Sony was about to launch something most people couldn't even afford to try breaking: PlayStation 3's $599 nightmare. Sony walked on stage at E3 2006 and said 5 words that instantly entered gaming history: $599 US. The PlayStation 3 launched at $599 for the 60GB model and $499 for the 20GB version. At the time, the Xbox 360 was sitting at $399 and $299, which made the PS3 feel less like a console upgrade and more like Sony was charging rent for it. Part of that price was the Blu-ray drive, over $200 in cost. Sony was basically betting the entire console generation on Blu-ray winning the format war against HD DVD. They did win, but at launch nobody was thinking about format wars. They were thinking about how to explain this purchase to their bank account. Then there was the cell processor, so complicated that developers needed a PhD just to make a loading screen behave properly. Early PS3 development was trial, error, and emotional damage. And then came E3 itself, which somehow turned into a meme collection in real time. First, Genji Days of the Blade. A producer proudly explained that the game featured battles based on real historical events in ancient Japan. Then a giant enemy crab appears on screen. No warning, no context. The solution? Attack its weak point for massive damage. And just when things couldn't get more chaotic, Kaz Hirai, who would later become Sony's CEO, stepped in and shouted, "Ridge Racer," with the energy of a man trying to convince the universe it was exciting. It wasn't a presentation. It was basically the birth of gaming internet culture in HD. Behind the memes, there were real consequences. The PS3 launched expensive, hard to develop for, and without the usual third-party momentum PlayStation relied on. Even GTA went multi-platform, which hurt even more. Sony eventually recovered with price cuts, better tools, and major exclusives like Uncharted 2, but the early damage stuck around for years. The PS3 didn't just have a rough launch. It became the console that got memed before memes were even fully mainstream. Sony's problem was price and complexity. But Nintendo's next console had a completely different issue. People didn't even know what it was supposed to be. Nintendo Wii U marketing confusion. Nintendo spent millions advertising the Wii U, and most people still thought it was just a tablet accessory for the original Wii. That was the problem. Not the hardware, not the games, just the name and the messaging, which is kind of important when you're trying to sell a console. The name Wii U was the first mistake. People couldn't tell if it was a new console, an upgrade, or something you plug into your existing Wii. Some buyers literally thought it was just the gamepad add-on. Nintendo never really fixed that confusion. The marketing made it worse. Ads revolved around the gamepad controller, not the actual console. So instead of looking like a next-gen system, it looked like an expensive accessory you'd lose behind your couch in 2 weeks. And when people finally understood it was a new console, the PS4 and Xbox One had already arrived with stronger hardware and clearer identities. Third-party developers drifted away. Why optimize for confusion when you can just make games for the competition? Sales reflected it brutally. The Wii U sold around 13.56 million units worldwide, compared to the original Wii's 101.6 million. That's an 87% drop. In gaming terms, that's not a sequel. That's a warning sign. But the most important part of the Wii U story isn't the failure itself. It's what happened inside Nintendo. Satoru Iwata, the president of Nintendo, took a 50% salary cut in 2014 to avoid laying off employees during the Wii U's struggles. Other executives followed with voluntary pay cuts. It wasn't a PR move, it was a leadership decision that showed responsibility at the highest level. Iwata passed away in 2015, but that moment is still remembered as one of the most respected gestures in gaming history. Because while the console failed, the company chose not to make employees pay for it. I think about this moment a lot. In an industry where layoffs are basically seasonal, Iwata's decision still stands alone. And yes, people often bring up the Virtual Boy as Nintendo's worst-selling console by raw numbers. But the Wii U is remembered differently, not because it sold the least, but because it fell so far from what Nintendo normally achieves. At least the Wii U's problems were marketing and messaging. The next disaster buried an entire industry. Literally. The ET Cartridge Burial. Atari buried hundreds of thousands of cartridges in a New Mexico landfill. And it didn't just hide a failure, it helped crash the entire video game industry. It started with E.T. the Extraterrestrial, a game based on one of the biggest movies ever, rushed out in 5 weeks to hit the 1982 holiday deadline. 5 weeks. Most people can't finish a side project in that time, let alone a licensed game Atari bet millions on. It launched to almost universal criticism. Atari still produced around 5 million cartridges, expecting massive demand. They sold only about 1.5 million. That left millions sitting in warehouses, slowly turning into very expensive regret. Then, in September 1983, Atari made one of the most infamous decisions in gaming history. They dumped around 10 to 20 truckloads of unsold inventory into a landfill in Alamogordo, New Mexico. This wasn't just ET cartridges. It included Pac-Man games, consoles, computers, and whatever else they needed to quietly erase from existence. The site was reportedly crushed and guarded afterward, like it was less a landfill and more a crime scene for bad business decisions. For decades, people claimed millions of ET cartridges were buried there. The internet treated it like gaming's Area 51. Then, in 2014, a documentary crew for Atari Game Over dug the site up and recovered about 1,300 cartridges across multiple titles. Not millions, not even close. But the burial itself was only a symptom. The real damage was the 1983 video game crash. Within 2 years, the US video game market lost around 97% of its revenue. That is not a downturn. That is an industry disappearing in real time. Consumers stopped trusting games, retailers stopped ordering them, and companies like Atari went from dominating entertainment to literally dumping their product in the ground. The aftermath was so severe that when Nintendo launched the NES in 1985, they avoided even calling it a video game console, branding it as an entertainment system to distance from the crash. That's how badly the word game had been damaged. Atari destroyed consumer confidence in gaming, but Sega found a way to destroy retailer confidence in a single afternoon. Sega Saturn's surprise launch disaster. Sega announced the Saturn would launch on September 2nd, 1995. Then, in classic Sega fashion, they released it nearly 4 months early at E3, without telling most of the industry. At E3 1995, Sega walked on stage and basically said the Saturn is available right now, except only at select retailers, Electronics Boutique, Babbage's, Toys R Us, Software, etc., with just 30,000 units at launch. technically a launch, just a very selective one most people couldn't actually participate in. Retailers did not find this funny. KB Toys, one of the biggest chains at the time, was completely left out of the surprise launch and responded by straight up boycotting Sega. Imagine launching a console and immediately losing one of your biggest retail partners before most people even know it exists. That's not momentum. That's self-sabotage with a marketing budget. On paper, the Saturn launched at $399, but it wasn't as simple as more expensive for less. It came with a pack-in game, Virtua Fighter, and built-in memory. Meanwhile, Sony's PlayStation launched at $299 without a game or memory card. The comparison was more complicated than it looked, but nobody in 1995 was doing spreadsheet analysis mid-hype. The real problem was timing and trust. Third-party developers were completely blindsided by the early launch. Games weren't ready, support wasn't aligned, and the launch library ended up feeling rushed and thin. Then came the moment that basically sealed the narrative. Sony's Steve Race walked onto the same E3 stage, said one word, $299, and walked off. No explanation, no follow-up, just pure pricing damage delivered with confidence. 5 seconds on stage, decades of Sega regret. Internally, things weren't better. Sega executive Bernie Stoller later said, "The Saturn is not our future," while still at Sega. The corporate equivalent of jumping out of a moving car and announcing you were never driving it anyway. The Saturn didn't just struggle because of hardware or games. It struggled because Sega managed to confuse retailers, surprise developers, and lose momentum in the same breath. Sega burned its retail relationships with the Saturn, but its next console would prove that being too smart about hardware can be just as deadly as being disorganized. Quick question, which of these disasters do you actually remember living through? Drop it in the comments. And if you're finally understanding why some of your favorite consoles disappeared, hit the like button. It genuinely helps the channel. Dreamcast's online vision too early. Sega built the first internet-ready console in 1999, but almost nobody had the internet speed to actually use what it could do. The Dreamcast was ahead of its time in a way that almost feels unfair in hindsight. Every unit shipped with a built-in 56K modem, the first console to treat online connectivity as a standard feature instead of an optional add-on nobody bought. On paper, it sounded like the future. In reality, it sounded like a dial-up tone followed by patience testing. Sega launched SegaNet for online play, but only about 3% of US households had broadband at the time, so most players trying to experience online gaming were also experiencing lag, disconnects, and the emotional damage of waiting for a page to load like it was a loading screen in real life. Sega even planned a proper broadband network, expected to roll out around 2003. The Dreamcast was discontinued in 2001. The infrastructure for its best failure basically arrived after the console had already been declared dead. A broadband adapter did release in 2001, but it came too late, only worked with a handful of existing modem games and never officially launched in Europe. Meanwhile, the PS2 announcement alone was enough to slow Dreamcast momentum to a crawl. Its DVD functionality made it an instant value machine for mainstream buyers, even before people fully cared about the games. Third-party support also collapsed. EA and Square refused to commit to the platform, meaning fewer major releases and less long-term confidence in the system. By March 31, 2001, Sega officially discontinued the Dreamcast and exited the hardware business entirely after 11 years. Just like that, one of gaming's most ambitious hardware companies stepped out of the console race for good. I still think about how different gaming would be if Sega had just lasted 3 more years. Xbox Live launched in 2002 and proved everything Sega believed in. The timing is almost cruel. Sega was right about the future. They just couldn't survive long enough to see it. But not every console failed because it was ahead of its time. Some didn't even survive their own warning signs. Nintendo Virtual Boy Eye Damage Panic. Nintendo released a console that came with health warnings about possible permanent eye damage, seizures, and nausea, printed directly on the box. And somehow, that wasn't even the most alarming part. The Virtual Boy used a monochrome red LED display inside a headset that you had to literally look into like a futuristic binocular nightmare. The result was immediate eye strain, headaches, and nausea for a lot of players. It didn't feel like playing a game so much as your eyes negotiating a ceasefire with Nintendo. And despite being called portable, It absolutely was not. It came with a tabletop tripod stand, meaning you couldn't move it while using it. So it was portable in the same way a microwave is portable if you really believe in yourself. The game library didn't help either. Only 22 games were ever released for it, which means the system had fewer games than most modern consoles have firmware updates. Sales reflected the chaos. The Virtual Boy sold around 770,000 units worldwide against Nintendo's expectation of 3 million, their lowest-selling standalone console ever. It launched in August 1995 in North America and was pulled by early 1996, roughly 6 months. In Japan, even less. That's not a product of life cycle. That's a limited-time apology. Behind it all was Gunpei Yokoi, the legendary designer of the Game Boy. He reportedly felt pressure to release the Virtual Boy before it was truly ready. After its failure, he left Nintendo shortly afterward. The irony is brutal. The man who helped define portable gaming also ended up tied to one of its biggest misfires. And unlike most console failures, this one didn't just confuse players or disappoint expectations. It actively made people take breaks from gaming because gaming itself was making them feel worse. At least the Virtual Boy only hurt your eyes. Nokia's next gaming device managed to hurt something even more important: your dignity. Nokia N-Gage Sidetalking Mockery. Nokia made a gaming phone that forced you to hold it sideways against your face just to make calls, and the internet has been laughing about it ever since. To make a call, you held the thin edge against your ear. This became known as Sidetalking, which was so ridiculous it got its own dedicated Mockery website. Yes, Sidetalking.com existed. That's how far it went. But the design issues didn't stop there. If you wanted to swap game cartridges, you had to remove the back cover and take out the battery every single time. So playing a new game was less insert cartridge and more perform a small disassembly procedure and hope nothing resets. The screen didn't help either. It was vertically oriented on a device meant for horizontal gaming, so every game looked like it was being played slightly wrong on purpose. Sales reflected that confusion immediately. In the US, the N-Gage sold only around 5,000 units in its first week. Lifetime sales reached roughly 3 million, which sounds okay until you realize Nokia expected double that and was competing against the Game Boy Advance, which sold over 81 million units like it was a national sport. Nokia eventually tried to fix it with the N-Gage QD, removing some of the awkward design choices. But by that point, the reputation was already locked in. The damage wasn't technical anymore, it was cultural. The N-Gage didn't just fail as a gaming device, it became a punchline. Nokia tried to make gaming portable and fail, but Ouya tried to make gaming affordable and somehow managed to do even worse. Ouya Kickstarter collapse. $8.6 million. That's how much 63,000 people gave to a Kickstarter promising real console gaming for $99. It became one of the biggest crowdfunding campaigns in history, and almost none of those backers got what they paid for. It started in July 2012 with a goal of just $950,000. That goal was destroyed almost immediately as the campaign exploded into a cultural moment. People genuinely thought this could be the new kind of console. Then reality showed up. The retail launch was delayed from March to June 2013 due to production issues, including controller buttons that literally stuck during testing. Usually not what you want to discover after people have already given you millions of dollars. When it launched, the hardware felt underpowered. Under the hood, it was basically a budget Android device in a cube shell. The idea sounded futuristic, but the performance felt like it was constantly apologizing for existing. The game library didn't help. The free-to-try model confused traditional console players and didn't attract serious developers. Most of the catalog was low-effort Android ports that already existed elsewhere, just now slightly more expensive and slightly more disappointing on a TV. Then there was the controller. Input lag issues, unreliable Wi-Fi, and a touchpad nobody really asked for. It felt like every design choice was made by different teams who never spoke to each other. At its peak, Ouya was everywhere in discussion, but in actual living rooms it quietly struggled to stay relevant. Eventually, the company sold its assets to Razer in 2015, and by June 2019, all online services were shut down. That effectively bricked any games that relied on servers, turning the console into a physical reminder of crowdfunding optimism. It wasn't just a bad console, it was a lesson in what happens when expectation runs faster than engineering. Ouya proved that crowdfunding hype couldn't save bad hardware. But what if the biggest tech company on earth, with unlimited money and infrastructure, tried the exact same thing? Google Stadia's billion-dollar lie. Google announced Stadia as the future of gaming. No console, no downloads, no installs. Just click a button and instantly play AAA games through the cloud like magic. On paper, it sounded like Google was about to delete the entire console industry. In reality, it was about to discover that internet latency does not respect ambition. Stadia was revealed at GDC in March 2019 as a revolutionary cloud gaming platform powered by Chrome. The promise was simple. Your phone, laptop, or TV becomes a high-end gaming machine instantly. No hardware upgrades ever again. Then it launched in November 2019 and reality showed up immediately. Players ran into connection issues, input lag, inconsistent performance, and the small problem that most devices didn't even support wireless controller features properly at launch. Turns out the future of gaming still needs stable Wi-Fi. Another major issue was ownership. Stadia charged full price, around $60 per game, but you never actually owned anything. If Stadia disappeared, your library disappeared with it, which is exactly what happened. Behind the scenes, things weren't much better. Stadia missed internal targets for controllers, users, and engagement by huge margins. The growth just wasn't there, no matter how much Google promoted it. In February 2021, Google shut down its first-party game studios, including Jade Raymond's team, killing the chance for exclusive titles that could have given Stadia a real identity. At that point, it was losing its reason to exist. Then came the most infamous part of the story. In July 2022, Google publicly told users Stadia was not shutting down and that they were always working on bringing more great games to the platform. That was July. By September, less than 60 days later, Google announced Stadia was dead. The service officially ended on January 18, 2023. Google even issued full refunds for hardware and game purchases. Corporate language for "we are closing this" and pretending it didn't happen financially. Stadia joined the Google graveyard, the internet's running list of ambitious products that met reality and lost. And just like that, a platform that was supposed to replace consoles became another example of why streaming cannot replace ownership that easily. And that's every major console disaster, from Atari burying cartridges in the desert to Google burying an entire platform in the cloud. 40 years apart, and the lesson still hasn't changed. Price has to match perceived value. PS3 and Saturn both proved that even great hardware fails at the wrong number. If consumers can't understand what you're selling, they won't buy it. Saturn, Dreamcast, and Wii U all died the moment devs walked away. Hardware reliability cannot be an afterthought. Microsoft spent $1.15 billion learning that. Timing matters as much as innovation. Dreamcast was right about online gaming, just 3 years too early. And if you publicly promise your product isn't dying, it's probably already dead. Every successful console that came after, the Switch, PS4, Xbox Series X, was built on lessons learned from these exact failures. If this finally made gaming history make sense, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Now, here's the thing. You just learned about the consoles that failed and why, but the consoles that survived, they did it through hardware innovation, especially in graphics. And there's one set of settings that controls everything you see on screen: resolution, ray tracing, anti-aliasing, DLSS, textures. Terms that get thrown around constantly, but most people have no idea what they actually do, or which ones to change first. That's exactly what we're covering next. Every graphics setting explained simply what each one does, which ones actually matter, and which ones you can safely ignore. Click the video on screen right now, and I'll see you there.